So hi everyone, thanks for joining. So today I want to talk to you about a problem. It's 2017 and we still have collaboration issues between designers and developers. We still have waste of time and misunderstandings, missed deadlines, and a lot of frustration between designers and developers. Let me start by introducing myself. I'm Nicole Saidy, and I come from Lebanon, and I'm UI UX designer, and I'm also a design teacher at a coding bootcamp called Loagon, which is around Europe. And so why listen to me now? Well, my boyfriend is a developer, and I'm a designer, and we work together a lot on multiple projects, and I have the time to think about this process and this collaboration a lot, because I'm working on that all the time. So let's take a look at this waterfall that Paul talked about, waterfall process. The designer starts researching, doing user research and developing this idea and research and design and prototype. And then when they're done, they send this to the developers. And the developers start implementing and building. And if they want anything from designers, then they will ask. But this process is kind of a static one-way deliverable process. It works, it lacks the collaboration between designers and developers, and it leads to frustration. It leads to inefficient results as well. So because of this process, there's a us versus them mentality, designers versus developers. And this is what we want to get rid of. How many times have you heard this, I thought you knew? I thought you knew that we're going to use this button for this design, not this button. I thought you knew that we changed the homepage and you didn't know about it. So assuming things because of this lack of communication during this process. Or also, if the manager asks one of the designers or developers, what is the developer working on, for example? What is the designer working on? I don't know what they're working on. That's the usual answer. They don't know what the other team is working on. So the first thing we need to do is start defining goals together. This is the main idea, the main solution that we can have for this problem. Designing in isolation is no longer an option. We have to start working together, brainstorm together as a team. So we want to get from this to this. We want to start designing and developing together at the same time with more back and forth deliverables. So both designers and developers should be giving and receiving feedback throughout the process. So how many designers are in the room? And how many developers? And I assume the rest are project managers or something in tech, right? Okay. So most of us are familiar with this process. We start by discovering, ideation, inspiration, and brainstorming. Then we start defining user stories and visualization and design. And then we start prototyping, building, and at the end of the process, we test and refine. And this is a cycle. But only if you realize how important it is for developers to be involved in this process as well. So developers always tend to be the last people to know about the project. They're always playing catch up with designers. So this is what we want to change. Now, what can we do to fix this collaboration? The first thing is to design for documentation. Designers need to remember that they're actually doing something that they will deliver to someone else. And these people are going to be working with these files that the designer is working on. So we need to make the developer's job as easy as possible. We always have to remember that implementation is a conversation between designers and developers. It's not a one-way handoff. It's not, here you go, we're done here. It's something that's always iterative. So we need something to deliver with this design that has some consistent guidelines, like a manual. Can anyone think about something like that? Something that designers can deliver with their design as a manual. Yeah, exactly. So always provide a style guide for developers. A style guide is like a manual. So we have to think atomic modular design instead of pages. So I love this quote by Stephen Hay that says, we're not designing pages, but we're designing systems of components. So we have to start thinking in small, reusable components first. So a style guide could be very simple, or it could be in categories, it could be advanced, it could be whatever we want depending on the project, what the project needs. But the point of this style guide is to provide a manual, as I mentioned, but also to provide context for every component. So whatever you're doing, if it's a color, if it's buttons, anything, any component has to have a context. When do we use this component? And the nice thing about style guides is that you can agree on color naming and conventions right there in this process, and when to use them. And for buttons, for example, it's very important to show the context behind each button and when it's used. And having this consistency is beneficial not just for the collaboration, but also for the final product. For designers, if you want to make a style guide on Sketch, there's a very cool plugin called Craft Styles by InVision. And the nice thing about this one is after you design your pages and you're done with them, you can generate a style guide from these pages. So all you have to do is just click on Create Styles. It will generate a bunch of colors and typography. And the nice thing about it is that you can find and fix inconsistencies. So if you find a color that is used twice, but a very slight difference between them, you can fix that in the style guide and just update. And it will update on the whole pages. So another thing to do to fix our documentation is to also use management tools. So this is to organize our features with developers. It could be Trello, it could be Jira, it could be anything. The point of it is to better manage our projects. So there's a cool one called Zenkit. Not sure if it's popular yet, but I came across that one and I think it looks cool. It looks a bit better than Trello. So maybe you could check that out. It has a few other features like the calendar, like the sitemap, colonization. So it's pretty cool. So let's talk about this next thing, the design for interaction. We have to remember as designers, we're not designing something to look in a certain way only, but also to interact and run and behave in a certain way. So the first thing we need to do in order to better translate these ideas for developers is to start wireframing together from the start, from the first beginning. So this is the best way to always be on the same page with developers, and it improves brainstorming and solving problems because we're starting to think about the ideas together from the beginning. So pairing designers and developers in this process has a lot of benefits. Developers could start knowing the scope of the project, and they could even start coding the components in the database of this project from the beginning. So they don't have to wait for the design until it's over and to deliver them and start working on them. Another similar thing to do from the beginning is to prototype together as well. So we need the developer's opinion in our design. We need to know their feedback and what can be done, and they need to test it and iterate with us designers. So a prototype could be a quick wireframed prototype, or it could be the final prototype. But the point of it is to test it together, sit all of us together and iterate and test together. So we have to stop thinking in terms of static mock-ups. Instead of a handoff, let's think of a dance between designers and developers, constantly building prototypes, testing, presenting, and iterating together. And this is what we need to start doing when we're working with developers. So we have to forget about static mock-ups. And if we want to make our prototype even better, we need to use real content. Now, of course, this is not doable when the clients are stubborn and don't want to give us the content beforehand, or maybe they just can't give us. But the point is, if we can't use real content from clients, what we can do is at least use some content generators to make our prototype as real as possible. So there's a cool plugin for Sketch called Content Generator, and All you have to do is just select the things you want to generate content for. You could choose names, addresses, cities, numbers, percentages, and also images as well. So it's easier to test with real data, especially with developers. Another thing to mention in interaction is to always design for different states. So we have to consider the different scenarios that can happen for each component. And I was reading an article on Medium. It's called The 9 States of Design by Vince Spielman. And he says, as we learn to craft systems rather than pages, we must invest effort into shaping these often missed states of design. So what does he mean by these missed states? There are 9 states according to him, and some of them are an empty state. For example, when you have a list and it's empty, what happens then? Or if you have one item in a list, what happens when you have just one item? Or if you have too many items in a list as well. So if you have more than 10 items, do we have a pagination? Do we have a load more? All of that. And the same applies for our style guide that we saw earlier. So a checkbox can also be disabled, it could be checked. An input could have an error, it could be done, it could be empty. So all of our components have so many different states. And same for buttons. They could be hovered, they could be focused, pressed, loading, etc. Now, of course, this makes our work a bit more difficult, but it's very important because it saves our time later on, and we make the developer's job easier. So let's move on to the next one, designing for technology. Designers could be as creative as they want. They could do multiple things, but not everything can be done on the web. So they have to know what can be done, what is compatible with the developer's work, and what are the challenges and considerations. So this is really important. For example, let's talk about the challenges. Performance. So we need to start thinking that if we're designing for the web, this means every file matters. Every font file, for example, the images, how big they are, the sizes, all of that. Everything matters on the web. So have to consider that while designing. Frameworks. Some developers use frameworks, Bootstrap, Material Design Lite, or even JavaScript frameworks. We have to be aware of that. We have to know how they're done and be in sync with them. Platform. The user's platform is really important to consider, not just the size, not just responsiveness, but also if it's a low-end device, if it's a high-end device, if it's very huge. So all of these things are considerations to always keep in mind. Internet connectivity of the user. And I come from a country that has 0.5 megabyte per second speed. So trust me when I say it's really important to consider internet connectivity of the user. And finally, the budget. The budget of the project is also something to consider when we're thinking about the technology of the project. So we also have to know how much time does this feature take in terms of implementation. So designers, you're not graphics artists, you're designers, which means we're not creating concepts here, we're creating solutions for the web. So it means if you don't know how to code, or at least how coding works, it means you're creating concepts for the web. You're not really designing for the web. So that's why I always recommend any designer who works digital to learn the coding basics. For example, HTML, CSS, maybe a bit of JavaScript. But the point is to know how it works and how it could be implemented. So get out of your comfort zone, start learning a bit how coding works, and you could do it online, you could join meetups, conferences. And this is to avoid the lost in translation scenarios. We have lots of them. The designer is thinking of something but can't really know if it's doable or not. The developer is frustrated because the designer doesn't know how they work. So these frustrations could be avoided. And there are lots of things that developers give as comments for designers, but here are the most common ones. For example, try not to use more than 3 fonts, because every font file matters, as I mentioned, and especially font variations. Not a lot of designers know that every variation of a font, if it's regular, bold, italic, all of them matter. So it's not just one font family. Try to achieve as much as possible with only HTML and CSS. So try not to use the blending modes on Photoshop, or try not to use the Photoshop filters and all of that, unless they're doable on HTML and CSS, because this takes more time from the developers. And the design should always be aligned with the framework. So at least just know how, for example, Bootstrap works and how it could be modified. So if you want to modify something, just know how it's done, just to avoid frustration and waste of time. Same for developers. So not just designers need to learn how to code, but also developers need to learn the design basics. If developers are working with designers, then they have to know how design works. Some principles, for example, contrast, hierarchy, color principles, white space. These are principles that are very important to know in terms of development. And this also gives you the ability to develop your taste for design. So develop the eye for design. And it will give you the ability to identify strengths and weaknesses in design. And this is really important if you want to give feedback to designers. So another thing we can do to improve technology between designers and developers is to use collaboration tools. So there are lots of them. For example, InVision recently released the inspect feature. It's still in beta mode. But what this does is the developer will be able to inspect the designer's work right there in InVision without having to download Sketch. And this eases the transition between designers and developers, because they'll be able to see the CSS code behind it, to save images, export assets, and basically play around with the design, but without touching the design at the same time. You can't really edit if you're a developer. So this really gives a guidance and eases the transition. Another one is Avocode. So Avocode is very similar. It only does that, whereas InVision does a lot of other things like collaboration and prototyping. And there's also other tools that you can know about. So, responsiveness. The collaboration between design and development becomes particularly difficult when it involves responsiveness, because it has more deliverables, more discussions, more wireframing, and all of that. So the first tip would be to design mobile first. Now, of course, this is debatable with designers. Not a lot of designers might agree with me. But I think designing mobile first is really important, especially the fact that the number of mobile users is growing and growing every year, and it exceeded the number of desktop and laptop users. So this is something else to always keep in mind when you're designing. Another thing, if you're in doubt, start by the smallest and largest screens first. Start discussing these screens with developers at the beginning, because when you tackle the extreme viewport sizes first, you'll be able to make the hard choices on the small screens first, so you'll be able to think about what are the features that are very important for me to show and how can I show it. And the same thing, the opposite considerations come for the largest screens. How much content is too much? So when we do that in the beginning, it will be easier for us to continue the process. Another thing is to discuss layout breakpoints with developers. So there are lots of in-between states. We have lots of the web is fluid, so we have to understand that not only we shouldn't only design for mobile, tablet, laptop. We should design in the in-between states. So we could do that by wireframing, we could do that by discussing, by sending an email. Doesn't matter. What matters is to always discuss these breakpoints and not leave them until the end. Same thing for images. Images are important to discuss also in the beginning, because we have to understand what are the formats needed for this one. Do you need JPEG? Can I use SVG? Do we need to have inline SVG? How many sizes do we need for the images? 1, 2, 2 times, 3 times, all of that. So avoid leaving these decisions till the end. Now, another Sketch plugins, I'm obsessed, I know, is to use responsive plugins. So there's one called Auto Layout. If you want, as a designer, to make your designs responsive inside Sketch, you could use this one. So by choosing the element's behavior So each element you could choose its behavior and how it behaves when you make the artboard bigger. You could make it responsive. So you can make the design adapt with the artboard size. Another thing is fluid. So this one, when we design, we always have some change requests, or maybe we want to make the text bigger, the image is smaller. And when this happens, usually we have to just fix the layout accordingly after we're done, right? So what this one does is that after you change something, you could just click Update Layout, and it updates, depending on what you've entered as behavior beforehand. So this is also nice. You could add relative margins in between the layers, etc. Now, if you use these two together, Fluid and Auto Layout, we could make a full prototype on Sketch. So we could make them, for example, here we're using Update Layout, and then it's also responsive at the same time. And there are lots of other plugins for Sketch for this. There's one called Launchpad, and it's a bit new. Does anyone know about this? Yeah, it's new. I think it's like last week or 2 weeks ago. Yeah, and so not only this makes our design responsive, but it also has a prototype feature inside Sketch. So after you're done designing, you could make everything responsive, you can make them clickable, you could make links and forms even. So it's a final full prototype. So it's really nice to give developers this kind of prototype. It's done. So let's move on to the final one, designing for content. Lorem ipsum or content generators might be enough for design, but we also have to consider that we're designing with dynamic content in mind. Some things we're designing are dynamic. So most probably the content that you design sometimes will most be likely input through a CMS. And from the CMS, we don't have control over design. So we have to think of that in the beginning. So just like we did for the components, we also have to consider the different states of content. So every content can have different states. Let's take a look at this one. This is a card. It has a title and description and an image. So there are lots of scenarios that can happen to the content of this card. For example, what if the title is too long? If it's now 2 lines. If the title is too long, do we make the card bigger, or does it have a maximum character? What if the title is too short? What if it's less than 2 lines? Do we leave some space here, or do we make the card smaller? And what if there was no picture? Do we have a placeholder, or do we just remove the picture? And what if there was no content? What if the card doesn't exist? What do we do with it? Do we have an empty state, or do we create an entire section that is different? So all of these things are considerations to always keep in mind when designing for dynamic content. So I'm going to end this talk with some key elements of collaboration. What we've seen so far are technical things to improve our collaboration. But what can we do to make some humane collaboration with designers and developers? So, motivation. Everyone needs to feel like they're working towards a meaningful thing and a meaningful result. So this is also something to always keep in mind, to make ourselves or each other feel motivated. Communication. As I mentioned before, communicating early and often is really important. Keeping each other up to date, working closely together even. This really helps these informal conversation between designers and developers. Diversity. Benefiting from a wide range of expertise and skills is really beneficial because you'll be able to learn from each other and everyone could be at the same level instead of hierarchical. Support, especially in times of crisis. For example, there's a very short deadline or someone has removed their files. So keeping each other and care about each other is really important as well. And especially if we give each other our expertise as advice. Empathy, learning each other's knowledge, just like I mentioned, designers knowing how to code, developers knowing how design works. It will give us the ability to understand each other's language. So we'll be able to communicate more smoothly and more clearly. And lastly, appreciation. You might think that this is not really important, but try to think about the last time you weren't appreciated. It's really horrible. So being grateful for each other's work is also something to always keep in mind when designing with a team. This is a list of inspiration articles that I used to create the content of this talk. And I hope you enjoyed the talk. You can find the slides on Twitter. I'm going to tweet them in a bit. And this is the link of my talk. You could add your comments there or if you have any questions. Thank you.